going to begin our study of the book of Daniel tonight, but we're not actually going to be opening the book of Daniel yet, just because I would like to get a background, kind of a historical setting for this book. It is a very unique book, to be sure, and it's split right down the middle. But what I want to challenge you with is, as you study through books of the Bible, that you would have kind of a methodology as you study. It's not just you grab a verse and you dig into the verse. Before you do that, back up and study the book as a whole. It's really important to have the context, the main idea of a book before you get in deep with certain passages. There are folks that will do that. They'll have a topic, they'll just research the topic and just start digging in on a verse. But the context of the book makes such a difference in getting a right perspective. So I want to encourage us to do that as we begin the study of Daniel. So understanding the flow of the book and its main point will help you keep specific parts in proper perspective. And I have a personal habit that if I know that I'm going to be preaching through a certain book of the Bible, I outline the book first. We actually went through this in our Sunday school class a couple of years ago, probably bored the garbage out of everybody, but I wanted our young people to learn you've got to think about what you're reading. And there is a beauty and a structure to how God gives us information in the Bible. And each book of the Bible is very unique in its structure. It's incredible when you start to compare and look at the different books, but starting with an outline is really, really helpful. Now, the book of Daniel divides neatly into two sections. The first 6 chapters are going to be historical, and then the next half, or the second half, will be prophetical. The book of Daniel has a message of 3 basic areas: world history, courageous heroes, and prophetic hope. And it covers a time period which is pretty old, around 606 BC to 533 BC. And I've been doing a lot of historical research on this time period, and it just makes me want to go visit the Middle East. It really does. I mean, there are so many cool things that it would take me years to work through the promised land in of itself. But looking at this area, it makes me want to go to Iraq, because that's where Daniel was. He was in the heart of the Babylonian Empire. And there are some amazing things over there as well. But all of that aside, before we look at a very simple outline of the book of Daniel so that we get a good idea, I have found that there's a group that does summaries of the books of the Bible. I've showed videos here before, and the fellow that does this research, I've heard him speak on different topics. He's more of a research / behind the microphone kind of guy, but if you actually watch him present in front of a crowd, he is quirky and weird. You could tell that he's uncomfortable, but he's got a heart to communicate for the Lord. So it's kind of entertaining to watch, in all honesty. But he has a great way of summarizing large amounts of information. And he does it in a way with videos on his website that I was very, very impressed with, because I like to draw, and I'm very pictorial in how I understand things. And this guy combines really good research and drawing at the same time to help communicate really complex things. So I'm going to grab one of his videos here that details the book of Daniel for us.
The book of Daniel. The story is set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken a wave of Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, whose later name Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this two-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12 it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and it puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. And so the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power, and so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these 2 stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a God, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so, like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts, and like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire, and it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament, and there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The three stories of faithfulness despite persecution, these are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final three visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final two beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is an image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people and his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that in a sense they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus's empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong, and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
I find stuff like that really helpful and kind of entertaining when you're drawing at the same time. But that context, that basic understanding of the overall point is super helpful, because now when you're going into individual stories, you know it's a piece in a whole. It has a purpose for being there. Sometimes it's easy for us just to look at a section of scripture and say, okay, I can learn from this story. Well, yes, you definitely can, but there are more layers. God's word is very intricate. Let me get this out. It's very complicated. It's very complex. It always intricate. Thank you. It always has a purpose. And as we're growing, we get new levels of new depth of understanding from God. So as we learn to study, we should be getting to the point where we can dive a little bit deeper. So as a very basic understanding, let's back this up a little bit here. The historical half of Daniel falls under four basic rulers mentioned in this book. But if you look historically and do your research, the book of Daniel only highlights four major ones. There are actually more. There's another four rulers during these time periods, but they're not important enough to note, which is not a big deal. Chapters 1, verses 1 and 2, Israel is enslaved by the Babylonian Empire, and this would all be under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar I was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before this, about 600 years, and Nebuchadnezzar II is 605 to 562 BC. So as Israel is enslaved by the Babylonian Empire, they pull the cream of the crop back to Babylon from Judah. Daniel and his three friends and the rest of chapter 1 stand for purity while they are being trained, while they're being indoctrinated, while they're almost forcibly assimilated into Babylonian culture. The Jewish people are very, very unique in this world and always has been. Typically, when your people group gets pulled out of your home country and out of your safe environment and culture, and you're thrown into a separate, distant culture, over a couple generations, your culture begins to disappear. That's what has happened time and time and time and time again throughout history. Yet, the Jewish people have been unique throughout all of time and history in that they will move to a different area, and while they become very involved in that community, they stay very distinct, which is absolutely bizarre. But we know it's because they're God's special people. So Daniel and his three friends are standing for purity while they're being trained. Yes, they integrate to Babylonian culture, but not completely. They never leave God or the mandates of how God wants them to live. Chapter 2, Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream and is promoted. Chapter 3, the three Jewish boys are miraculously saved from the fiery what, folks? Furnace. There you go. You're familiar with all these. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's pride and lesson. He ends up 7 years like a beast. Then after Nebuchadnezzar, we have the reign of Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Now, Nabonidus he's one of those that is not mentioned in the book of Daniel. Belshazzar was. So Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus. The reason Nabonidus isn't mentioned is because he's actually living in an oasis palace out in the desert by himself, not even running the country. He leaves that job to Belshazzar, his son. So Belshazzar's in control while dad's off worshiping the moon god because the rest of Babylon was worshiping a different god. And he's like, I'm going to do my thing out in the desert. And basically the Babylonian people hated his guts. So that when his time is over, they're thrilled about it. Chapter 5, Belshazzar, his son, is full of pride, and with his lesson and downfall, the writing on the wall. And it's that very night that he is assassinated, and the Persian king Cyrus II, or Cyrus the Great, comes into play. So this is the shift between the Babylonian Empire moving into the Medo-Persian Empire. And then you have another ruler mentioned, Darius the Mede. This is chapter 6, where Daniel is miraculously saved from what? The lion's den. Oh, typo. Daniel is miraculously saved from in the lion's den. Sorry, that is a terribly constructed sentence. I apologize. The word in should not be there. So that's the first half of the book. Now, starting in chapter 7, we've already seen a basic rundown of those. Chapter 7 is Daniel's vision of the beasts, and they are some weird ones, very, very symbolic in all those different details. Entire books and commentaries have been written about this stuff. Chapter 8, Daniel's vision of the ram and goat. And by the way, these visions are not being given in chronological order, but they are put here for a certain reason. I do not know what that is. Chapter 9, Daniel's vision of the 70 weeks. Chapter 10, Daniel's vision of the glory of God. And then the last two chapters are all one vision of rulers. And yes, they're very repetitive, and we actually see a lot of repetition in the book of Revelation. We see a lot of repetition in different parts of the Bible, and that's almost always for emphasis. It's definitely coming. And God is trying to give us different angles, drill those points in a little bit deeper. Now, I will note very quickly about Darius the Mede. There is another ruler in this area of the world that's going to come, it's about 15, 20 years after Cyrus the Great, and his name is Darius the First. I was like, oh, well, that's the Darius. I don't believe so, because that would put Daniel at like 105 years old by the time this guy comes along. Now, I'm still researching. I was told by somebody else that the name Darius may actually be a title. So there may be different rulers that were given this title, and that's why historically different folks will say, see, that's why the Bible is a bunch of garbage, because you look at real history and there is no Darius the Mede. So the Bible's wrong. Well, I'd like to encourage people like that. Give it about 40, 50 years, and they're going to dig something else up and go, oh, that's the guy. Because they're constantly learning new facts about history, and current historical findings are not up to date with the Bible yet. They have so many different times denied the authenticity of the Bible simply because modern historians hadn't found something, and about 40, 50 years later, then they find it and go, oh, well, okay, the Bible's right there, but there's a bunch of other stuff we don't know. So I don't get nervous whenever modern historical findings don't have something in the Bible. I'm not worried about that at all. It'll come. And God doesn't tell us everything. And history isn't going to find everything. So as we get that basic outline, now we need to back up just a little bit before the actual history of Daniel begins. Because it's really easy just to jump into the story of Daniel being taken from his home and being integrated into Babylonian culture. But there's a very important lesson I think we would be wise to get a hold of tonight by looking at the big picture of history and world empires. It is really easy for us to get nervous when we watch the news, when different regimes come into play, when different countries become powerful, when there is war all over the place, like, oh man, something crazy, what's going to happen? It's going to be World War III. Whoa, relax. This is not the first time there's been bad things happening in the world. In fact, you look at some of this history and just stick yourself as a little regular person in the middle of all this, and it'd be really easy to say, the world's falling apart, we're going to go to World War III. But it doesn't happen because God's in full control of everything. So a good view of history will remind us to stay calm and remind us that God is in full control. So if we back up a couple hundred years, we look back at 760 BC, God sends one of his prophets to the Assyrian Empire. The picture up there is the basic layout of how far the Assyrian Empire actually controlled. And so they were over just on the border of India, all the way through Mesopotamia, into Southeast Turkey, down through what we would know as the Promised Land, all the way down into Egypt. The Assyrians became very powerful. And these folks were known for their incredible brutality. As I was studying through these different empires, it starts to become more apparent at how empires try to keep control of all the land that they scoop up. And there are different ways of doing it. The Assyrian nation held control by brutality. These folks were scary. Everybody was terrified of these invading armies. These are the people that when they would come in, they take everybody's heads up and then they pile them by the city gate. These are the guys that when they come in, you would want to die in battle because they would torture you to death to prove a point. rip your tongue out. They became experts at skinning people alive and keeping you alive for a long time, of impaling you on a pole and leaving you up there to die. These folks loved their brutality to such a point, it was decoration on their pottery. They would actually decorate their home goods with scenes of torture. That's what these folks were like. And that is why when God sent one of his prophets to Nineveh, to the capital of Assyria, that prophet didn't want to go. And instead, that prophet headed in the opposite direction and ended up getting swallowed by a very large fish. Anybody pick up who this prophet might be? Okay, it's Jonah. So in the area of world events, Jonah did not want to go to the capital of the Assyrian Empire and preach a message that you guys better straighten up or God's going to deal with you, because God might just forgive them. And that's the last thing Jonah wanted. He didn't want God to be merciful with these barbarians. He didn't want their empire to go anywhere, because they had literally scooped up all the surrounding area and they were coming for Israel next. Jonah had a lot of fleshly reasons to not want God to give these people grace, but to judge them instead. Well, Jonah went to warn Nineveh. You guys know the rest. They heeded it. They heeded that warning. Jonah got upset, and the book of Jonah ends. 745 to 727 BC, the next leader of the Assyrian Empire, Tiglath-Pileser III, he takes Assyria to even greater heights, combining the kingdoms of Assyria and Babylonia. So Babylonia, you see on the map, is in the southeast. They were a lot smaller back then. They had a lot of rebellious leaders try to basically use guerrilla warfare to resist the Assyrians, but it didn't work. Assyria took over everything. The prophet Isaiah is warning and preaching in southern Judah that Assyria is going to be invading. Don't get the idea we're out of this, because we are going to get invaded and taken over. God said so. One of the reasons Isaiah wasn't the most popular prophet. 750 BC, other prophets are involved also in the land of Israel. Hosea gives his last prophetic warning, and the warnings of Elijah, Elisha, Amos, they've already gone completely unheeded in northern Israel and Samaria. Nobody wants to listen to God. Nobody wants to straighten up. Oh, we'll be fine. We've got might and power. They're not going to mess with us, all these different things. That's not what God was saying. 732 BC, Tiglath-Pileser actually conquers northern Israel. 722, the next ruler, King Shalmaneser, and his general Sargon complete the job. They completely take over northern Israel and haul everybody out of there. After northern Israel is completely taken over, then in 705 BC, the next ruler, or actually general at this point, Sennacherib, begins his rule over the Assyrian Empire and unsuccessfully tries to conquer southern Israel. This is spoken about in Isaiah chapter 37, 33 to 37. If you know your, I believe it's English literature, Lord Byron wrote a very famous poem called The Destruction of Sennacherib. And it was actually about this situation where Sennacherib was coming in with this massive army, and then overnight, God just wipes them out. 100,000 some people just dead. They wake up in the morning, scared to death. They all head back home in complete defeat. That's because of the hand of God. 699 to 627 BC, Ashurbanipal ruled Assyria. 640 BC, God had the prophet Nahum take a warning to Assyria's capital, Nineveh. Wait a minute, didn't Jonah just do that about 140 years before? Or 120 years? Yes. Why?
Except he's taking a warning, whereas Jonah's supposed to.
Well, same basic idea, except under Jonah, the Assyrians said, you know what? We're going to shape up and listen to God, and God spared judgment. Nahum took a warning because they had gotten bad again, but this time they totally ignored Nahum, and God brought judgment against them. 627 to 620 BC, the Assyrian Empire experiences a civil war. The Assyrians were really good at expanding their empire. They were really bad at keeping it together. A lot of civil war, a lot of weak rulers, a lot of mess, a lot of drama. 620 BC, next leader Nabopolassar gains control of Babylon. 612, same guy, Nabopolassar, marches on Nineveh with his son Nebuchadnezzar leading the army. So Nabopolassar, again, is one of these southeastern Babylonian rebels who gets up enough guts and muscle that they're able to march in and start fighting against the Assyrian Empire. And Nebuchadnezzar becomes the ruler of the Babylonian Empire in 605 BC when Nabopolassar is out of the picture. Nebuchadnezzar is an incredible emperor. This guy knows how to manage. He took the Babylonian Empire and completely ate up the Assyrians and then added the Medes and the Persians. Then he the Mede Empire, and then he snagged up Egypt. He took the old Assyrian Empire and completely expanded it. The Babylonian Empire is even bigger than the Assyrian one. So we see the Assyrian Empire became very strong at first, but due to civil wars and unrest and weak leaders, they eventually fall apart. And the opening for Nebuchadnezzar to come in and take over worked. This is what God said was going to happen. They were going to fall in judgment. So now you have the rise of a new empire, the Babylonian one. 612 BC, after Nineveh's fall, the Assyrian Empire divides into three main powers. Media, which is to the northeast, they were ruled by Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon itself, the main empire, was ruled by Nabopolassar. So the king and his son/general, they divide out those areas. And then way down in Egypt, you have Pharaoh Necho, who is kind of weak. But he still has his homeland for the moment. So after you have these three basic divisions, they're going to become all absorbed into the Babylonian Empire. But before that happens, Jerusalem and southern Judah say, you know what, we have a chance here to fight against these new invaders, but we better buddy up with somebody because we're not strong enough to actually resist this new invasion. So they trust or put their trust in Egypt, because at this point, Egypt had snagged up more land with Nebuchadnezzar and Nabopolassar taking over the Assyrians. Like, well, they're kind of losing control over the south. Let's snag up some property while they're all distracted. So Jerusalem says, you know what? If we link up with Egypt, we'll be able to combine our forces and we'll be able to stay safe from both of us getting invaded. Well, it didn't work. 2 Kings gives us a lot of that history. God actually warned Judah, do not put your trust in the Egyptians. Bad idea, but they do it anyways. 607 to 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar begins a campaign of western expansion, which means he's going to head west to the Mediterranean and then head south. The Medes crush Egypt in Carchemish. So Carchemish is, let's see, you see where on the map it says Babylonian Empire? That first B head a little bit north to where the Mediterranean Sea comes to a point. Carchemish is right up above there at the end of the Euphrates River. Basically, Egypt is going to run up into the north and try to help the last holdout of the Assyrian Empire. Guys, we'll back you up. And then Nebuchadnezzar says, awesome, you guys just grouped up and now I get to take out both of you at the same time. And Nebuchadnezzar crushes the Egyptian army there, and the last of the Assyrians. The Assyrians are now completely gone. Egypt runs back home with their tail tucked between their legs. And thus, because Egypt was holding over Palestine, Nebuchadnezzar now has control of all of Palestine, because Egypt's like, I can't control them anymore. I can't protect anybody but myself. I'm just running home. 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar keeps coming down the Mediterranean, and he sacks Jerusalem, taking home prisoners like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So now we can open up the book of Daniel and see all this world turmoil, how empires are rising and falling, new ones are taking over, world leaders are strong and then they're weak and they're foolish, and then they become powerful and they get gutsy and arrogant, and all these different battles. And this is why Daniel and his 3 friends end up being scooped up from Jerusalem and taken all the way to Babylon. It actually takes a couple months to get all the way over there by land. But Jerusalem was warned 107 years prior. God had been giving warning after warning after warning, prophet and messenger after prophet and messenger. Y'all better straighten up or I'm going to bring the hammer. And nobody would straighten up. And now they find themselves getting exactly what God said would happen. But God promised in Jeremiah 29 that their captivity would only last for 70 years. So even in the warnings of punishment, God always gives hope. It's like, look, for you guys, the punishment is coming, but is going to be limited. You can make it. But by the way, the only ones that are going to make it are the ones of you who have a right heart. The rest of you, you're done. So it is a big encouragement that even though world events are not exactly helping you out, you and I have to keep a right heart because God has a plan for those that want to follow him. It doesn't matter what happens to the rest of the world. You walk with God. That is the end game right there. That is what is most important. So as Nebuchadnezzar is scooping up more land, and his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had the Median Empire in the north, well, his father gets old, dies, and so Nebuchadnezzar inherits the Median Empire as well, and he now owns from Egypt all the way north into Turkey, all the way up to the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, all the way east to India. It is the biggest world empire that has ever been. And Nebuchadnezzar's sitting on the throne. And the guy is incredibly good at managing. Now, if you go back with me a few minutes ago, I said the Assyrians like to keep control by brutality. The Babylonians were different. They like to use economics. They actually pulled together a common currency and spread things out in that way so that they were able to keep control and kind of unify all of these different areas that they were absorbing into their empire. Now, after Nebuchadnezzar, there's going to be a Persian takeover even of this empire. Now, the Persians were different. They used different mechanisms to try to keep control of those areas as well. So there's different governmental and road system improvements that they use. It's amazing because you see battles and you just think, hey, you got a kingdom now. How are you going to keep your kingdom? You got a whole lot of people and a whole lot of territory, and frankly, you just made a whole lot of people mad because you stormed into their main cities, burned them all down, moved people around. How do you keep control over these folks? Different ways of doing it. So there is so much to be learned from history. It's incredible. And I want to encourage everybody to keep a strong head on your shoulders, just because it is so easy to look at world events and watch the news and get scared. But God was in full control of all of this history, was he not? He was prophesying what was going to happen, and it happened. And he brought certain things into play to bring about certain ends. God is always in control. So when you and I turn on the news and we see pandemonium and we see screaming heads and we see questions and fears, we don't have to be afraid because God is in control today, just like he was in control way, 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 way back then. God has never lost his grip on anything. So we do not have to be afraid. So let that be an encouragement for you this evening. But I would ask that for the next few minutes, and we've actually got a full half hour, that you take the next 3 questions and personalize. I don't ever want to just give you guys information and you go home educated. Oh, yay, this is like high school world history class again. Ooh, really helpful. There's a personal application here. We need to see why God shares all this history with us and actually have something to use right now in life. So I would ask that you guys group up, take the next half hour. We got plenty of time to get through all three of these. You can dive in as deep as you would like or make it basic. Either way, just make sure that if anybody is around that doesn't normally have a group with you, invite them in.